Okay, so here we are for muscle physiology part 4. Um, Last time I made a video, I talked about the all or nothing law, and then I said we were going to talk about the sarcomere. So hopefully you have learned about the sarcomere already, and you remember the all or nothing law. If you're watching this and we haven't talked about the sarcomere yet, I think it will be fine. Um, so, use your time how you best can. But know that like that would normally be in between part 2 and part 4. The sarcomere is part 3, basically. So anyway, when we talk about the all or nothing law, I said that it applies only to individual muscle cells. So once they get started contracting, they have to finish. But, that could be one cell out of a million. So in order to generate different levels of tension so that you don't like go to pick up a pencil and use the same amount of tension that you would to pick up a 20-pound dumbbell, your muscles can react with different graded responses. So you can use a small amount of tension when picking up a pencil and a larger amount when you're picking up something heavier, for instance. So that can happen kind of in two different ways. It can happen temporally, which means in time, or it can happen spatially, in space. So temporal summation means that the frequency is changing. So instead of a big break in between the muscle stimulation, it's being stimulated more frequently and faster and faster. And you'll see a graph of this in just a second that I think will make that a little more clear for the temporal summation. Spatial summation, I think, makes more immediate sense. And that is just changing the number of cells that are stimulated. So if you're lifting something heavy, you're going to want to recruit more muscle cells, more muscle fibers to contract. So here you can see just a variety of muscle and their stimulation time periods. So here's just kind of a generic graph for a single muscle cell. So there's a latent period where everything is resetting, in the sarcomeres are resetting. It contracts, and then the muscle relaxes. So this is just kind of generic. Here we can see different muscles that need to react kind of in different times. So there's always a little bit of a latent period where everything's resetting. And then some muscles, like this extraocular muscle, moves your eye. So that reacts very, very quickly because you need to be able to look around very quickly. So then we have the gastrocnemius, which reacts more quickly. That's your calf muscle. And then the soleus, which is another muscle in the calf, a deeper muscle than the gastrocnemius that needs to stay contracted for walking, standing. So it reacts much more slowly because structure and function are interconnected. Sometimes there is a situation where there's not that relaxation afterward. The signal keeps coming to keep the muscle stimulated. So this is temporal summation. There's no relaxation. The signal to contract keeps coming. Then what happens is the muscle stays contracted, and we call that a tetanus. You might be familiar with tetanus from like a tetanus shot. This kind caused by temporal summation and not by bacterium is good. It means that the muscle stays contracted so that you can continue to do the activity. So here is a graph. So here's if there's just a single twitch, a single contraction. If you get a couple signals at once, the first one is lower and then the second one is higher. So it's like, if you remember interference with waves in like physical science, the second one is bigger. And then if you have lots of signals all being sent, ultimately they can fuse. And that's what we call tetanus. So the muscle is just staying contracted rather than contracting and relaxing, which is good if you're trying to like carry something, for instance. Okay, so that was temporal. This is spatial. So spatial summation, so temporal, the signal is continuously being sent to keep the muscles contracted. Spatial summation is an increase in the number of motor units recruited. That says recruited. Totally does. So you're activating more muscle cells, basically. And then they all add together, so you get a bigger result. The more stress that's put on the muscles, like the heavier thing that you're trying to lift, the more motor units are activated. So the more need for muscle activity, for contraction, the more muscle cells that are involved, basically. So here you can see, again, kind of the idea of spatial summation. So once we hit that go point, then as more and more muscle fibers are activated, you get a maximum contraction. So here, like nothing is happening. Once you hit the action potential, you get a little bit of tension. Maybe this is a pencil. Maybe this is if you need to lift like a paperback. Maybe here you're lifting a textbook. And here you're lifting like a very heavy box. So you do get to a point where you can recruit more and more fibers, but it's not going to add to the amount of contraction because there is a maximum. But recruiting more fibers gives more contraction. More nerve fibers are excited, more muscle fibers are contracting, and you get a bigger effect. So to do all of this, to make your muscles work, you need energy. We talked about how ATP was necessary to kind of reset the sarcomere so it could contract further. And that needs to happen all the time throughout our body, and more or less depending on our activity. So there are 4 sources of energy that can be used in order for our muscle system to be really flexible. So, depending on what is required and how quickly it's required, different fuel sources, different energy sources can be used by the muscle. So, the first source is one that you're familiar with, and that is ATP storage. So, within your cells, mitochondria take sugar, turn it into ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. Um, and so you have some ATP in your cells, but that is limited. That only gives about a 4 to 6 second sort of burst of energy. So if you were being chased by a bull, for instance, you could activate those, use those ATP stores for a quick sprint away or a quick jump. But after 4 to 6 seconds, that ATP is all back to ADP. It's used up. So now you need another energy source. So the next one is creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is another phosphate molecule. And so what can happen is it can donate that phosphate to the ADP. ADP has 2 phosphates. ATP has 3. So that phosphate gets taken by the ADP to make ATP, and then that ATP can be used as an energy molecule. So you're not using like the creatine phosphate itself, you're just taking advantage of that phosphate to recharge the batteries. Okay, so if we think about a really fast race, like a 100-meter dash, for instance, that is going to use ATP stores first, and then it's going to use creatine phosphate for the energy to get through that very fast race. So this is an additional 10 to 15 seconds. So we're up to about 20 seconds of muscle fuel with ATP storage and then creatine phosphate. If you continue to exercise, to move beyond that, then cells are going to have to start making new ATP as you're exercising. You might remember this from biology, but there are 2 pathways that this can occur. 2 ways this can occur. So the first pathway is the anaerobic pathway without oxygen. So this is called glycolysis, and this produces lactic acid as well. This can make a little ATP, but very quickly. So if you were sprinting like a 400, do you sprint that? Then your cells would be entering this glycolysis. Okay, so they're breaking down sugars, making a little bit of ATP, but doing it at a fast rate. If you are doing something that takes much longer, where you're able to get plenty of oxygen into your cells. So if you are swimming 1,000 or swimming a mile or something, that would let you enter aerobic respiration or just like normal everyday life kind of things. that makes the most ATP, but it occurs much more slowly because that's the oxidative phosphorylation that happens in the mitochondria. Um, so this is the most kind of beneficial in terms of ATP production, but it's very slow, which is why it's number 4, because it takes the longest, but it's the kind of the best option for a lot of ATP without a lot of lactic acid and stuff. Okay, so once you have used your fuel, you're continuing to make ATP, eventually your muscles will start to fatigue. And so what happens is they become unable, like physiologically unable, to maintain the force of the contraction. So you can run for a long time or play basketball for a long time, but ultimately your muscles themselves will start to fatigue. So this can happen if there's not enough calcium released to travel along the sarcolemma and then go deep into the muscle. It can happen if you run out of creatine phosphate, and so you can't replenish the ATP anymore. If there's not enough oxygen to go through oxidative phosphorylation to make a lot of ATP. I didn't talk about glycogen, but glycogen is stored in the liver and in the muscles, and it gets broken down into glucose, which then can be used, like sent into the process of either glycolysis or oxidative phosphorylation to make more ATP. So if you run out of glycogen, that's what we call like hitting the wall. You don't have any more of the raw materials you need to make more ATP. If too much lactic acid builds up, so if you're in anaerobic conditions for too long, lactic acid will start to build up. You'll have lots of ADP, but not ATP, so your batteries are kind of run out of charge. And the other thing that can happen is that the communication between the nerve cells and the muscle cells, like that, something with the acetylcholine, kind of fails. We don't totally know what the mechanism for muscle fatigue occurring is, but it's kind of a multifactorial situation that ultimately your muscles will just kind of stop working because they don't have the conditions that they need. The other thing that we see as muscles fatigue, as a lot of exercise is performed, is oxygen debt. So as you're doing an activity, you're using stored energy, you're using ATP that's produced from sugar, things like that. And once you're done exercising, you need to replenish all of those things that were used up during the exercise. So the more oxygen that you need, the higher the oxygen debt you have, because you need more oxygen to replenish all of those things. So when a person is starting to have a very high oxygen debt, we see a couple of signs. So the signs you might expect if you think about what's going on: increased heart rate and increased breathing rate to try to get more oxygen out to the muscle cells. Muscles will start to get tired and sore, and then ultimately, if it gets too bad, you get this feeling of hitting the wall, you can't go on, and your muscles just stop kind of doing what you're telling them to do. So hitting the wall is a combination of kind of muscle fatigue, oxygen debt, just not having the signals being processed correctly because there's not fuel to do that. Okay, so I think this is the last, this is almost the last thing I want to talk about. So this is the idea of muscle tone. When we relax, muscles don't relax to zero tension. They always stay a little bit active to keep some tone. So it's ongoing activity to maintain tension. You have a bit of tension in your muscles, even when you're like sleeping and things. They just get activated systematically. The motor units get activated just to maintain a little bit of tension in the muscles, so you're just not a blob. So that's muscle tone. They're just always being activated little bits at a time, even if they're not in use, to kind of maintain tone, maintain a little bit of tension, etc. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about are types of muscle fibers. And if you are an athlete, or you know people who are athletes, you might kind of have thought about this a little bit, which is why we're talking about it. Plus, we live in, well, I don't, but you all live, like in Tracktown, USA, so there's lots of thought about running in particular. Maybe it's just because, who I work with. So in our bodies, we have basically two different types of muscle fibers. We have fast twitch fibers and we have slow twitch fibers. And for most people, they're right about 50-50. Fast twitch fibers are bigger. They have more contractile proteins, so more actin and myosin. And they're faster at using those early pathways, so they can contract much more quickly. So I'm going to write that down and then I'll talk more. So fast twitch muscle fibers can use energy more effectively in the shorter, like 2 and 3 muscle burning area, fuel burning area. So they're quick if you need to sprint away from the bull that's charging, or jump out of the way of a bison or something. Those are fast twitch. Okay, so slow twitch fibers kind of have the opposite job of fast twitch fibers. They are organized for endurance, so long distance, long time. They have more mitochondria, so they have a better aerobic capacity. They're better able to do number 4 on the energy chart, to make lots of ATP over a longer period of time. And in order to do that, they need sugar, they need oxygen, and so there are more capillaries in the slow twitch fiber to help supply the muscle with more blood, more sugar, and more oxygen to do that process of oxidative phosphorylation. If you are an athlete, you might want to know, like, can you switch from one to the other? And so you can, to a point, selectively build up the different types of fibers. So you can increase mitochondria and increase blood supply for slow twitch muscles by working on longer endurance activities and by doing more um, sprinty uh, activities faster that recruit fast twitch muscle. You can add more myofilaments, more fibers to the fast twitch muscle. So you can't like totally change your makeup, but through training, you can kind of improve one type or the other type. So that is it for muscle physiology. Um, Thanks so much for listening to me for many minutes. Uh, bye.